So back in the 1900s, when I was a youth pastor, I was a single youth pastor in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And before I was married and just straight out of college, an internship. And I got to the church and we were planning on going. The first week out, I was going to lead a bunch of teenagers on a conference to Tennessee. So I was excited to get to know some of the teens in the new church that I was at. And the leadership was excited because they had just bought, 2 weeks before I got there, they had just bought a brand new 15-passenger van. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a whole lot to you guys, but back in the day, church vans were a big deal, right? And most churches had a beat-up van, that they carry kids in. Like, we value kids, and we're going to put them in this junk, van. And so this was a big deal. It was beautiful. It was brand new. They were excited about it. They spent $30,000 on this new 15-passenger van, and that was about 30 years ago. So it was expensive, but it was nice, and everyone was proud of it. Everyone was excited about it. It was this grayish, like a modern kind of color. It had our church's logo and our church's name, and everyone was excited about it. I mean, you could get into the van and you could smell the new car smell. Like there's nothing better in this world. And so I was excited because I was going to be the first one to actually drive it on a trip, and straight out of college. And so the day before, I decided to go and get gas, fill this van up with gas so that I could be ahead of the game and wouldn't have to worry about the day of the trip. And so I go and get gas. Literally on the odometer, it had 139 miles on it. That's how brand new this thing was. And so I go and get gas and fill it up. And then before I head back to the church, before I head back to the home, I realized that I needed to get some cash out of my bank for this trip. And so I decided to swing by my local bank. And so I go to the bank, and I wanted to go in, but it looked like there was a long line. So I decided to go through the drive-through with this new church van. And because I had really never driven a 15-passenger van before, this was not your simple car, okay? It's pretty long, and you have to get used to it. And so I go through the drive-through, and it's really, really tight. But I go really, really slow because I know this is a brand new van. This is my first week on the job. And as soon as I get to the window, I realized that this window was closed. I wasn't paying attention. So I had to back up and go into another lane. And as I was backing up, I was looking in my rearview mirror, my left and on my right, being very, very careful, going very, very slow. And all of a sudden, I heard this screeching sound. Like fingernails on a chalkboard, but like 10 times worse. It sounds like something is scraping the side of the new van. And I look in the rearview mirror, I see nothing. I look in the rearview mirror, I see nothing. And then I'm thinking, okay, and I can't get out because it's so tight, I can't get out to look. And so I have to back up. And as I continue to back up, the noise gets louder and louder, and there is nothing I can do about it. I am stuck there, and this horrible scratching, screeching sound, and I pull all the way back out. My heart's beating because I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. I hope this is not me. And I get out of the van, and I see this huge dent and huge yellow line all the way from the front of the van to the back of the van, the new $30,000 van, and my heart just sinks. Literally, I'm 22, 23 years old, and I am now crying because I can't believe this is my first experience at my new church. So I drive home, or drive to the church, the longest 2 minutes of my life. And I go into the church building, and I go into the pastor's office like a small kid going into the principal's office. I know I'm going to get yelled at. I know I'm going to get in trouble. I think maybe they might fire me. So I go in there. He lets me off pretty easily, but the damage actually came to $6,000. And that day, as through all my tears, I discovered two things. Number one is they should never give a 23-year-old the opportunity or the availability to drive a 15-passenger van. Never. It should not happen. And the second thing I discovered that day is that blind spots are real. In fact, that's true. Blind spots are actually real. Did you know that all of us have a blind spot in our eyes? There is a actual blind spot in a small little section of your retina. It's about the size of a pencil tip, but it's there and it has no photoreceptors at all. All human eyes have this blind spot. We don't normally recognize it because what our brains do, because this blind spot is so small, our brains just cross over that and fill in the gap of this blind spot so that we view things seamlessly through life. But we all have this blind spot in our eyes. But what's even more important for you and I to recognize, and what we're going to be talking about today, is that we have all of us in this room, we have another type of blind spot. These are things that keep us from seeing the truth of reality, whether that be in life, about ourselves, about others, about the world around us, about God, about faith, about Jesus. In fact, this is how I would describe this blind spot. It's anything in your life that prevents you from fully seeing reality. So as we go through today, that is the working definition that we're going to have for a blind spot. Anything, in other words, anything or any area of your life where you are unable to see truth as it really is, to see reality as it really is. That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, to get everyone up to speed on where we've been, we're in the middle of this series called Miracles. And we're asking the question, what would it take for you and for me, for us as people, what would it take for us to become more aware of and more dependent and more expectant of the miracles of God in our lives? Like that's the question that we're wrestling with. What would it take in your life? Because while most of us, we all would agree that we want and we hope for God to do miracles in our lives. The problem is we become very skeptical of miracles, the miracles that we read about in the Bible, becoming a reality in our lives today. I mean, let's just be honest. That's something that we all wrestle with. And so what we're doing is we're exploring these eye-opening, mind-blowing, supernatural acts of Jesus while he was here on planet Earth. And as we've been saying in this series, these weren't just some fancy illusions to trick people, to fool people into believing in Jesus Christ. No, this was the raw power of God working in and through the life of Jesus Christ. And the hope is that during this series, that all of us, we discover what can actually happen in our lives when the limitations of our lives collide with the power of God. Which brings us back to this whole idea of blind spots. Because blind spots may not just be character flaws that we just learn to live with, right? We all recognize that we have blind spots. We don't know what they are, but we all recognize we have them, and we just sort of brush it aside and say they're just character flaws and I just have to learn with these blind spots. But what you need to understand today is that these blind spots, your blind spots, whatever they may be in your life, they are extremely dangerous. And they can become destructive in your life if ignored, if left unchecked. In fact, there's a guy in the Bible whose issue wasn't that he had some blind spots in his life. His issue was that he was completely blind. He could not see a thing. And we're going to discover a few things about ourselves through this man's story. His story is found in John chapter 9. We're going to start with the very first verse of John chapter 9. It reads this way. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. This is all he knew, the Bible says. Everything that he knew was about his blindness. Which means that this guy had no understanding of the concept of color. He had never seen color before. So he didn't understand it. Think about this. He had never seen the face of his father or his mother or his brothers or his sisters or for anyone for that matter. This was all he knew. In fact, he had never seen the beauty of the countryside right outside of his village that he lived for so many years. Most of what this man understood to be true about life, or what he thought to be true about life, was up here. It was created in his imagination, not from his experiences. But at least this guy knew that he was blind. Right? He had been born blind, and that's all he knew. And so he understood his condition from day one. He understood the limitations he was going to have from the very beginning of his life. He's dealt with it every moment of every day of his life. And while most of us, as we read this story, we can't relate to this blind man. Most of us in this room, we've never been completely blind. And so we can't relate to this man. But we do have blind spots. And those blind spots are actually more dangerous in our lives than complete blindness. Because what blind spots are essentially are things that we are not aware of, things that we don't recognize. This blind man, he knew he was blind. He knew his limitations. Blind spots in our lives, we don't even realize that they exist. And so Jesus and his disciples are walking along and they come across this man who'd been blind all his life. Verse 2, Rabbi, his teachers asked him, which is what they typically called him. Rabbi is simply a Jewish term for teacher. Why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? There was a common thinking in those days that whenever there was someone who was disabled or diseased, that it must have been because of their sin themselves or the sin of their parents. They actually believed, most of God's people in those days believed, that this was a form of punishment from God to the person. And while this may appear to be a very flawed, tainted view of things, it was the conventional thinking of that day. As I was reading through that this week, I was reminded how I always cringe whenever there is a catastrophe in our world and some Christian stands up and speaks and says this is a direct punishment from God about how someone or a country or a nation or a people group live their lives. I don't know if you're like me, but throughout the years, there was a period of time when someone would do that and a Christian would come forward and say, this is why God is punishing them. And I would just say, you're such an idiot, right? In my mind, I would say, you're so stupid for thinking that. Now, I've matured a little bit since my early days, and so whenever someone does that, lately, I will think and think that is so reckless. Instead of calling them stupid, I will say that's so reckless of you. In fact, I would even take it a step further. Where I'm at right now, when someone, a Christian, speaks out and says, well, it's God's punishing them, I would call that now, and I would say that person is ignorant. They don't understand how God works. They're ignorant of how God moves and breathes in our world today. You see, the disciples asked Jesus a question, and it wasn't really a stupid question. It was an ignorant question. This is what they understood. They misunderstood how things work. They had a blind spot when it came to interacting with people who were different than they were. They look at this man, and all they know is he's blind. He's different than most of us. And they assume certain things about this man. Now, before we just throw these disciples under the bus, we need to recognize that this is a blind spot all of us in this room have. One of the most common blind spots that we will have in life is perception of those different than us. That's a blind spot for most of us in this room. See, the disciples assumed something about this guy because he was blind, because he was different than they were. And a trend that I'm noticing is becoming more and more prevalent, not only in our culture, but even in our Christian culture, even in our churches, is that when we encounter someone who is different than we are, when we encounter and interact with someone who doesn't vote the way we vote, doesn't think the way we think, doesn't look the way we look, doesn't believe the things that we believe, that we automatically, we quickly form an opinion about them and we judge them and we make a determination about who they are as a person, whether that is true or not. You see, what this blind spot will do in my life and your life, it will lead to you growing in areas that you do not want to grow in, like pride and arrogance and selfishness and intolerance and injustice and hatred and judgment. And these things, this blind spot, it's killing our culture. It's killing our churches. And more importantly, it's killing any chance you and I have of God doing the impossible in our lives. Listen, your perception of someone who is different than you are isn't necessarily reality. See, just because you perceive a person to be someone because they're different than you doesn't make that reality. Well, wait a minute, Steve. I've always heard perception is reality. Is that true or not? That is not true. Your perception may be your reality, but it is not necessarily the reality. And so what if one of your blind spots in your life is that you are unable to see people the way God sees people? Maybe you haven't realized that. But if you were to dig deep into your soul, maybe that's one of your blind spots, that you are unable to see people, especially people who are different than you, who think differently. They're just different. You're unable to see them as God sees them. What if today is the day that Jesus does the impossible in your life and begins to open your eyes and takes off the blinders and opens your heart to people who are unlike you so that you're able to see them for who they really are? There is way too much judgment. There's way too much criticism. There's way too much hatred and anger and pride and arrogance in our culture and in our churches. Maybe our perception of someone not like us is incorrect. And I think that's what's happening at the beginning of this story. These disciples come across this guy who they just can't relate to. He's different. He's been blind from the very beginning. And so they quickly and suddenly form an opinion about him. And just as quickly, Jesus corrects them. Look at what he says. Verse 3, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins. In other words, Jesus is saying, hey, I just want to debunk that myth right now, okay? Let's just clear the table. It's not because of this man's sin or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. Now, every time I come to this passage of Scripture, this confuses the heck out of me. I mean, is Jesus really suggesting that God allowed or caused this man to be born blind so that his power could be revealed in him? Is that what Jesus is saying? Is Jesus really suggesting that all the bad that happens in this world, that God will either allow it or cause it, and he will always bring good out of it? Is that what Jesus is really suggesting here? As I wrestle with this question, and maybe as you wrestle with this question, it brings to light another blind spot that I think many of us have in this room, is our short-sightedness of our circumstances. And this is a huge one for us. Because what so many of us do is we learn how to see things through the lens of our current circumstances. That is almost exclusively how you and I view life, view relationships, view God, view others. Whatever is going on in and around us, those things are the lens by which we see life. And if things are going good, that impacts how we view life. If things are going bad, that impacts how we view life. Understand, no matter which way the wind blows in your life, your current circumstances will taint and distort your viewpoint on everything. You have to recognize that. You have to be removed from the situation and your current circumstances to realize this is a blind spot for many of us in this room. Your circumstances can and will blind you from reality. I love how the Apostle Paul approaches our circumstances. He actually gives us a pretty healthy perspective and pretty healthy view on how we need to view all of our circumstances, even in the moment we're going through them. In Romans 8, verse 28, I've read this a lot here because I love this verse. It's a great promise, one of the great promises in the Bible. Romans 8:28, it reads this way. And we know, Paul the Apostle is talking to a bunch of Christians, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes for them. Now, oftentimes we will misinterpret what Paul is saying here. And we will say, okay, Steve, this is the promise that God will do good in every situation. So that means every situation that happens in life, there is a God divine purpose for that so that he can bring about his good. But that is not what Paul is talking about here. See, I think too often in my life and in your life, we will focus on God's will for a specific event or a specific circumstance that's happening right here in our lives. And we say, is this God's will or not? What we fail to do is we focus more on the actual circumstance than on our response to the circumstance. And that's where our focus needs to be, on our response, how we respond to our current circumstances. See, ultimately, it's God's will, God's big plan for your life and my life, for us to follow him, for us to love him and to live for him and trust him and surrender our purposes and our will to him. See, this promise that Paul gives isn't for those who choose to go their own way. It's for those who choose to go the way of God. God's power can work in you in any circumstance when you allow him to. This is huge. I promise, God will not waste any experience in your life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He will take every circumstance that you go through, and he will use it for his purposes if you let him. And that's the key. Will you let him? Will you allow him to do the impossible in your life, no matter what current circumstance you are dealing with? Again, the promise that Paul's making here isn't for those who go rogue with God. It's for those who want to go after God in his ways. Which brings us to this truth and this reality, is that Jesus Christ won't always take away your circumstances, but he will always be able to change your perspective on the circumstances. Let me just say that again. Jesus won't always, just because we ask him, he won't always just change your circumstances. He won't always just deliver you from a hard life or a hard situation. But he will, if you ask him, he will change your perspective on the circumstances, which may just be the bigger of the two miracles. Jesus changing our perspective of our circumstances. So back to this blind man. Jesus says, listen, it's not because of this man's sin or his parents' sin. That may be what you think the circumstance is, but it's to bring glory and honor to God. And then he says some interesting thing. He says, we must quickly carry out the task assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I'm here in this world, I am the light of the world. It's a foreshadowing of what he's about to do. Then, verse 6, he spit on the ground. Jesus spit on the ground. He made some mud with the saliva and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. This is what can happen when the limitations of life collide with the power of God. Jesus uses some spit and some mud and a local pool to make a man who had been blind his whole life to see again. I mean, isn't that incredible? I mean, it's just unbelievable. And I have to imagine, can you imagine what this guy must have been experiencing on his way back from the pool to Jesus? He'd been blind his whole life. And now he can see things. He can see people. He can see faces. He can see objects. Can you imagine? It's like whenever you come across on the internet or maybe on social media a video, they have those videos out there. Some of you guys have probably seen them of people's hearing for the very first time. You ever seen any of those? Or someone who sees color for the very first time. They videotape these because of technology. They can allow people who have never heard a sound in their lives, and they put this piece on them that enables them to sound, and they can now hear for the very first time. They can hear their mother or their brother or their sister or their spouse speak to them for the very first time, or they can see color for the very first time. And it's the same emotion and reaction every person. And these videos are people old and young, men, women, infants, and old people. All of these people, they have the same reaction. At first, they are somewhat shocked and amazed, and then they start to smile and they start to laugh because they're so happy, and that joy turns into crying, right? And they are bawling their eyes out because it's the first time they could ever hear. It's the first time they could ever see color. And every time I'm watching those, no matter where I'm at, they start crying and I start crying, right? That just happens. And then someone passes by and I'm like, I'm not crying, you're crying, you know? It happens every time. And I can just imagine the raw emotion of this man. And he's going through all the emotions as for the very first time in life, he can actually see. That's the power of Jesus. Here's something I've always wondered about this passage, though. Why did Jesus ask this man to go to the pool and wash his face? I mean, Jesus could have certainly just slapped the mud on his eyes, touched his face, and said, "You are healed." Bam. And the man could see. Well, I mean, why did Jesus have this man jump through so many hoops? It brings us to another blind spot I think we all deal with, is this expectation of miracles without obedience. I mean, this is a huge one again. Because so often I think we really want to have miracles happen. We want God to do the impossible, whether it's our finances or our marriage or our health or whatever that is. But we do that and we expect God to do miracles. God, if you are a God who still does miracles, I want this miracle in my life. But yet we do that with little or no commitment to do what God wants us to do. It's a blind spot for us. And understand there will always be an obedience component to God doing miracles in your life. God goes to Abraham and he says, I'm going to make a whole nation out of your family, your little family. I'm going to make this powerful generation and this nation of people that will last forever. But before I do the impossible, I'm going to need you to trust in me and obey me and leave your family and leave your homeland and go to an unknown place. Noah, listen, I'm going to do a miracle and I'm going to flood the world, but I'm going to save you and all the animals so that I can restore everything back to what I want it to be. But before I do this miracle in your life, Noah, I want you to obey me and build this massive ark that everyone is going to think that you're crazy for building. Peter, I'm going to allow you to walk on water like my son Jesus. I'm going to give you that power in the middle of a sea to walk on water, but you first have to obey me and take a step of faith and get out of the boat. Every time we see God doing something impossible with people in the Bible, it's after he's asked them to obey. And you and I are no different. God looks at you this morning. He says, I want to do the impossible in your life. I have the power. It's right there, ready for you. But you have to do what I want you to do. You have to obey. You have to take that step of faith. You have to listen to me. You want me to do a miracle in your finances? I'm ready. I can do it just like that. But you have to trust me with all of it first. I promise I have the power to heal your marriage. And I know it feels so broken right now, but you have to trust me and you have to take a step of obedience and forgive this person or ask them for your forgiveness. Whatever that is in your life, you cannot have the impossible without the obedience. And never, never underestimate how God can do something so big in your life when you just take one small step of obedience. And so here's a question for you, for me. What is one area of your life where you know that you're really not doing what God wants you to do? One area where you are struggling to obey God. Well, this blind man obeys Jesus, and he comes back changed forever. And look at how this story ends. It's actually an interesting dichotomy of the celebration that should be happening. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Surely he can't see." Some said he was. Others said, "No, he just looks like him." But the beggar kept saying, "Yes, I am the same one." They asked, "Who healed you? What happened?" He told them, "The man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me to go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and I washed, and now I can see." "Where is he now?" they asked. "I don't know," he replied. Then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath and that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. The Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them, he says, "Again, I tell you, he put the mud over my eyes, and when I washed it, I could see." Some of the Pharisees said, check this out, "This man Jesus is not from God. He had just performed an eye-opening, earth-moving miracle." And yet they say this man is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath. Others said, "But how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs?" So there was a deep division of opinion among him. Now, so let me just sum up all what's happening after this blind man sees. The people's doubt, all different types of people, their doubt is keeping them from living in the reality of who Jesus is. And believe it or not, there are some of us in this room that has become a blind spot. And it's what I call a crisis of faith. Maybe at some point in our lives, we believed Jesus and we believed that God could do miracles, but life has wounded us so many times that we are struggling now to believe that Jesus can actually intervene and overcome our most current situations. Maybe we've struggled to believe that Jesus really can forgive me and that he can love me just as I am. Maybe we've stopped believing that Jesus can actually intervene and overcome my most difficult life situation. It's what I call a crisis of faith. And some of us in this room, that's what we're experiencing. And I'm here to tell you, until you begin to take those blinders off, until you see Jesus for who he is, you will continue to doubt. You will continue to doubt the power of God in your life. You will continue to doubt the impact that Jesus can make in your life. Now, what I failed to mention to you in the story of the church van accident is that the day before, the leadership had actually put another additional mirror on both of the rearview mirrors, side mirrors. It's called a blind spot mirror. Some of you guys probably have it. They use it in large vehicles. It's just a circular mirror, and it's supposed to lessen the blind spot. It's supposed to try to get the blind spot away. Whatever that blind spot is, you can look into that mirror that's attached to the bigger mirror and you can see everything. But the truth is, even this blind spot mirror doesn't cover all the blind spots. See, no matter how hard you and I try in life to cover up all the blind spots, to make sure that we can see, that we are fully aware of truth and reality, and even some of you here, you think this isn't for me because I know reality, I know truth, Steve. No matter how hard you try, without the power of Jesus, you will not be able to take the blinders off. You will continue to have blind spots that can be damaging and destructive to your life if left ignored. So today the question is this: are you ready? And are you surrendering to Jesus to take those blinders off so that you can begin seeing life as a reality? Let's pray.